The graveyard's secret. On the outskirts of the quiet, forgotten town of Ravenshallow, shrouded in a perpetual mist, stood an ancient graveyard. Known simply as Blackstone Cemetery, it was a place steeped in unsettling legends. For centuries, whispers had circulated of the unexplainable occurrences that haunted its grounds. Locals avoided it, even in daylight, and no one dared step foot there after dark. It all began with a newcomer, Evelyn Harper. A journalist with a penchant for the mysterious, she arrived in Ravenshallow, seeking inspiration for her next big story. With her camera slung over her shoulder and a leather-bound notebook in hand, Evelyn set her sights on unraveling the mysteries of Blackstone Cemetery. Her curiosity was piqued by a peculiar detail. Among the hundreds of weathered gravestones, there was one that bore no name. It stood at the farthest edge of the graveyard, crooked and cracked, as if time itself had tried to erase its existence. The locals called it the Nameless Grave. According to lore, those who lingered too long near it were never the same again. Evelyn, undeterred by superstition, decided to investigate. The first night, under a silver moon that filtered weakly through the ever-present mist, Evelyn ventured into the cemetery. The iron gates groaned in protest as she pushed them open, the sound echoing unnaturally in the still air. Her footsteps crunched on the gravel path, the noise unnervingly loud against the suffocating silence. Reaching the Nameless Grave, she noticed a chill in the air that made her breath visible, despite it being midsummer. The grave's headstone was jagged and covered in an indecipherable, almost runic script. Evelyn crouched down, brushing away the moss to take a closer look. As she did, the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint whisper that seemed to say her name. She froze. Evelyn. The voice was faint, almost indistinguishable from the rustling of leaves, but it was unmistakable. She turned abruptly, her flashlight slicing through the darkness. There was nothing, only rows of headstones and the skeletal branches of dead trees. Just the wind, she muttered, though her voice betrayed her unease. She snapped a few photos and jotted down notes before retreating to her rented cottage for the night. But sleep eluded her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the gravestone and heard the whisper. It became more persistent, more distinct. Evelyn, help me. The discovery. Determined to uncover the truth, Evelyn delved into the town's archives the next day. She discovered records of a string of mysterious disappearances that dated back centuries, all tied to Blackstone Cemetery. Each victim had been last seen wandering near the Nameless Grave. As she dug deeper, Evelyn uncovered a chilling account from the 1800s. A gravedigger named Elias Thatcher had confessed to hearing voices near the grave. Days later, he was found dead, his face contorted in terror, his eyes wide open as if he had seen something unimaginable. Evelyn's unease grew. She began to feel watched, even in broad daylight. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edges of her vision, and she heard faint whispers wherever she went. Her camera, too, captured strange anomalies. In one photo of the Nameless Grave, a shadowy figure stood in the background, tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through the image. She hadn't seen it when she took the photo. The descent. On the third night, Evelyn returned to the cemetery. The whispers had become unbearable, and she was desperate for answers. Armed with a recorder, a stronger flashlight, and a heavy sense of foreboding, she ventured back to the Nameless Grave. As she stood before it, the wind stilled, and an oppressive silence fell. Then, the ground beneath her trembled. A deep, guttural voice echoed from the earth, unmistakably different from the whispers she'd heard before. Leave, or suffer. Evelyn's courage faltered, but her determination won out. Who are you? She demanded, her voice shaking. What do you want? The ground shook violently, and a low growl reverberated through the air. Suddenly, the earth before the gravestone split open, revealing a gaping void. From its depths rose a figure, cloaked in shadows. Its form was indistinct, shifting and writhing like smoke, but its eyes burned with an unnatural light. "You should not have come," it hissed. Evelyn stumbled back, tripping over a root and landing hard on the ground. The entity loomed over her, its presence overwhelming. Images flooded her mind, visions of torment, despair, and unspeakable horrors. She saw the faces of those who had disappeared, their mouths open in silent screams. "Why?" she managed to choke out. "What are you?" "I am bound," the entity growled. "Bound by their sins. Free me, or join them." The final revelation. Evelyn's hands trembled as she frantically wrote down everything she had seen and heard. The entity's words suggested it was trapped, imprisoned by some ancient force. But how could she free it? And should she? She spent the next day researching rituals and spells in the town's library, guided by the cryptic clues left by others who had encountered the grave. She pieced together a ritual meant to banish or release the spirit. The process was dangerous. It required her to confront the entity directly, risking her own life. That night, she returned to the graveyard one final time. The mist was thicker than ever, swirling around her like a living thing. The air was heavy with the scent of decay. As she performed the ritual, the ground shook violently, and the shadows around her deepened. The entity emerged once more, its form more defined this time. It was humanoid, with skeletal features and elongated limbs. Its voice was a cacophony of anguish. "Do you truly wish to set me free?" it asked, its tone mocking. Evelyn hesitated. "What are you?" she asked again. "I am vengeance. I am despair. I am all that was left behind." As the ritual reached its climax, the entity screamed, a sound that echoed across the town. The gravestone shattered, and the shadow dissolved into the night. Evelyn awoke at dawn, lying on the cold ground. The nameless grave was gone, replaced by a patch of scorched earth. She returned to her cottage, shaken but alive. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her back. In the days that followed, her dreams were plagued by the same shadowy figure, whispering promises of darkness. The locals reported strange occurrences in the town, lights flickering, shadows moving on their own, and an overwhelming sense of dread. Evelyn had freed the entity, but at what cost? And as she looked into the mirror one morning, she saw it behind her, its hollow eyes burning into hers. It wasn't gone. It never would be.
The haunting silence of Blackwood Forest. The mist clung to the ground like a thin veil, shrouding the world in an eerie silence. Blackwood Forest had earned its reputation as a place where the lost remained forever, and the whispers of the damned echoed through the ancient trees. For decades, no one had dared to venture deep into the forest's heart, until today. A group of 5 friends had decided to spend a weekend camping, seeking an escape from the mundane routine of their city lives. Nathan, the self-appointed leader, was the one who had suggested the location. He'd read about Blackwood Forest on an obscure website that listed the most remote and uncharted places in the country. The others, Hannah, Ethan, Sarah, and Daniel, were hesitant at first, but the thrill of adventure had swayed them. They set out early, the morning sun glinting off their backpacks as they made their way into the dense woods. Laughter filled the air as they joked about the ghost stories surrounding the forest. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows stretched like skeletal fingers, the laughter faded, replaced by an unsettling quiet. By the time they set up camp, darkness had swallowed the forest whole. The trees stood tall and imposing, their twisted branches like the gnarled hands of old crones. The fire they built crackled weakly, its light barely cutting through the thick blackness surrounding them. Ethan leaned back, trying to ease the growing tension. "So, who's got the scariest story?" he asked with a grin. But the question seemed to hang in the air, heavy and unwanted. Nathan smirked. "I've got one. It's about a group of campers who wandered into this very forest," he began, his voice lowering to a whisper. "They were never seen again. Legend has it that the forest itself consumes those who enter, feeding on their fear." Come on, Nathan, Sarah scoffed, though she pulled her jacket tighter around her. That's just a story. Is it? Nathan asked, raising an eyebrow. He leaned closer to the fire. They say if you listen closely, you can still hear their screams carried on the wind. A sudden gust of wind swept through the campsite, making the flames flicker and die down. Hannah shivered, not from the cold, but from a sensation she couldn't quite place. A feeling of being watched. I think we should turn in for the night, she suggested, her voice tight. The others agreed, though an uneasy silence settled among them. One by one they retreated into their tents, the forest now alive with the sounds of the night. The rustling of leaves, the distant call of an owl, and something else, something that sounded almost like whispering. Nathan awoke with a start. The fire had died completely, leaving only the faint glow of embers. He sat up, straining to hear what had woken him. That's when he noticed it. A low, rhythmic sound, like chanting. He stepped out of his tent, the chill night air biting into his skin. In the dim moonlight, he could make out a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was Sarah, her back to him, her head tilted as if listening to something. "Sarah?" Nathan called out, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond. He took a cautious step forward. "Sarah, what are you doing?" She turned slowly, her face expressionless. Her eyes were glazed over, as if she were in a trance. "They're calling," she said in a flat, lifeless voice. "Who's calling?" Nathan demanded, a knot of fear tightening in his stomach. "The forest," she replied. "The voices. They want us to follow." Before Nathan could respond, Sarah turned and walked into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. Panic surged through him as he rushed to wake the others. "Get up! Sarah's gone!" he shouted, shaking Ethan and Hannah awake. Daniel was already out of his tent, looking bewildered. "What do you mean she's gone?" Ethan asked, his voice thick with sleep. "She just walked into the forest. Something's wrong. We need to find her." They grabbed their flashlights and plunged into the woods, the beams cutting through the dense fog that had settled in. The chanting grew louder, more distinct now, like a chorus of voices speaking in an ancient, forgotten language. "Sarah," Hannah called out, her voice trembling. "Where are you?" There was no response, only the whispering wind and the sound of leaves crunching underfoot. They stumbled deeper into the forest, the trees pressing in around them, their twisted shapes forming grotesque shadows. Nathan stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. "Listen." The chanting had stopped. In the silence that followed, they heard it. The soft, distant sound of crying. "It's her," Daniel said, his voice a strangled whisper. He took off running, the others following close behind. The sound of crying led them to a small clearing, where they found Sarah standing in the center, her back still turned to them. "Sarah," Nathan said cautiously, stepping closer. "Are you okay?" She turned slowly, and they all gasped. Her eyes were pitch black, void of any white. Blood trickled from her nose and ears, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. "They're here," she whispered. Before anyone could react, the ground beneath them began to shake violently. The trees groaned as if they were alive, their branches snapping and twisting. Shadows moved between the trunks, dark, elongated figures with hollow eyes. "We need to leave, now," Ethan shouted, grabbing Hannah's hand. They turned to run, but the forest had changed. The path they had taken was gone, replaced by a wall of trees that seemed to have moved of their own accord. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped. The shadows closed in, whispering in a language that sounded like the rustling of leaves. One by one, the friends were separated, dragged into the darkness by invisible hands. Nathan fought against the grip, the whispers filling his head, drowning out his thoughts. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the forest, the trees closing in around him like a coffin. In the end, there was silence. Days later, the search party found the remains of the campsite. The tents were torn apart, and the ground was littered with belongings. But of the campers, there was no sign. Only a single camera was left behind, its battery drained, but the footage intact. The last recording showed the group huddled around the fire, laughing and telling stories. Then came the chanting, the whispers. The camera shook as it was picked up, the lens capturing a fleeting glimpse of a shadowed figure standing among the trees, watching. The final frame was of Sarah, her blackened eyes staring into the camera. "They're here," she whispered before the screen went dark. The forest remains silent now, but the whispers can still be heard if you listen closely. They say it's the voices of those who were lost, forever calling out for help that will never come. And if you find yourself standing at the edge of Blackwood Forest, turn back. For once you enter, you may never leave.